So part of this whole process was to identify the benefits. And as Madeline stated, when we first started that project, there was no holds bar. I mean, let's throw out all the potential benefits that we could win, right? So there was a long list in doing that. So while we were doing all of that, at the same time, we were trying to get the developer at the table. Now, this was a very different scenario or situation that we found ourselves in, because we were negotiating a public works project, right? And therefore, we were going to be negotiating with the city of Los Angeles. And we had to kind of figure out, well, how does that work, right? Because in other community benefit agreements, the whole basis of the community benefit agreement was that the communities agree to enter into this negotiation or into this agreement. Communities get benefits, and in exchange, the community organizations and the coalition then supports the project. Well, this was a little bit different with working with a governmental entity. So the basis of the agreement was, okay, the community organization or coalition gets the benefits in exchange for the promise of not to sue. You know, because that was the main thing. That was the main thing that the city was concerned with. You know, because in the past, when they did attempt to do an expansion in the 90s, there was a lawsuit, right? And so that kind of halted. So that was the city's main concern. The city wasn't really concerned if the community organizations were going to go speak against it in city council or anything like that. They just wanted to get the assurance that the coalition was not going to sue. So that was one of the bases, right? And so we had to kind of figure out, okay, well, who's going to sit at the table, right? So we at that point identified that the negotiators on behalf of the city was going to be representatives from the airport. Right, the airport entity, which was the Los Angeles World Airport. So we had their representatives that were going to come to the table. So part of that was having Miguel Contreras, who was the head of the Fed, calling the mayor's office and making sure that the mayor understood the leverage. And the leverage was, if you want to have labor support, and if you want labor to be advocating for this or not opposing this in the city council, you need to come to the table, and you need to negotiate. You need to negotiate in good faith, right? So we got the developer at the table. We started doing that, and there was a preparation, right? Because a lot of the folks had never been in any kind of negotiation, so there was some apprehension. Right, especially when you tell folks that they're going to be negotiating with the city, you know, they're going to be negotiating with attorneys present and things like that. So what we did is we engaged in a series of negotiation trainings and really engaged the participants in developing a negotiation strategy, right, and preparing for negotiations. And part of the negotiation strategies was identifying negotiation times. And this is part of setting up those rules that Madeline had talked about, negotiation rules, because we felt that in the initial meetings, we all needed to be clear in terms of the coalition what we wanted. Right? But all of that had to be dealt with separately in the coalition meetings. And we wanted to make sure that all the decisions that were made were strategic. So part of identifying how we were going to approach negotiations and develop negotiation strategies was identify negotiation times. How often were we going to negotiate and how long? The other thing is identifying negotiation areas, right? Figuring out, okay, in the different areas that we've identified, which negotiation points are easier and which are the hardest. And let's kind of mix them up, right? So that was another point that we discussed. We also talked about caucusing, right, during negotiations. If we felt that there was a point in the negotiation that, you know, it wasn't going smoothly or it wasn't going the direction that we wanted it to, then we would call a caucus, right? Pull out, discuss what we were going to do, or we would walk away for that day. We'd say, okay, we have to stop negotiations, things aren't moving forward. So those are some of the strategies that we identified. We also, before we went into the negotiation, we had identified our bottom lines, right? We already knew going in there which ones were deal breakers. And because we were dealing with the FAA, and that's something that I forgot to mention as part of this, because it was a public works project and it was tied to an airport expansion, we also had to figure out a way to deal with the FAA. And part of the things that we had to be aware of is that the FAA could override or overrule certain benefits. That we knew that according to FAA regulations, any profits or revenues from the airport had to be used on airport-related areas or issues, right? So then we had to revisit our whole list again, right? And we had to eliminate community centers, youth centers, things like that. So that helped us kind of hone down on our list, and that helped us identify which ones were our bottom lines, right? So now, we started negotiations, and we had identified who individuals within our coalition that was going to take the lead, right, on different areas. Obviously, in the environmental section of our list of our benefits, we had environmental scientists or environmental activists that had an expertise in that lead those discussions. Same thing with jobs piece. In the jobs piece, we had both labor and community organizations negotiating, making sure that there was first source hiring, making sure that we were negotiating the best training program possible. So as the negotiations went through, one thing to remember is that there always has to be heat in the street, right? Because that's what's going to give your negotiation the power and the strength to move forward. It's not really what's happening in the negotiations that's going to move it forward. You might have the best negotiators possible, but if you don't have the heat in the street, if you don't have a group putting political pressure, it's not going to move forward. So while all of this was happening, we were getting pushback, we were creating some sort of heat in the street. And part of the heat in the street in this case was having the labor movement lean on the mayor's office, having the labor movement lean on LAWA executives. And so, so that, I just want to say that was very important. Now, throughout this whole time, we were able to negotiate a good set of benefits, and I just kind of want to go through them. And this was interesting because I also want to mention that as negotiations were going through, we were constantly in communication with the city council. We were meeting with city council members, because they were going to be the ones that were going to be voting on this. We were constantly meeting with them. And it was coalition members, labor, all going together, talking to council members, informing them exactly what was happening as the negotiation was going through, right? So that was the other kind of heat that we were putting on the city. Now, we were able, when we were talking about the different components, we engaged some of the council members. And the interesting thing is that when it actually came for a vote, we had council members kind of competing with one another as to how high they can get the job training program, right? It started off at 6 million, and after we got some of these council members competing to see who was going to win the highest amount of a training program, we ended up with $15 million in job training funds for airport and aviation related jobs. So yeah, that was very interesting to see.